So in this course, what we're up to today, when we came to appreciate last week the richness of the European immigrant tradition. This is an experience that is rooted in labor organizing and socialist development. We appreciated white beans. Now let's taste the black beans. Today we will look specifically at the African experience. After understanding the European experience with voluntary immigration last week, we will juxtapose Europe with Africa so as to appreciate the involuntary immigrant experience. So in this session, we will come to appreciate how involuntary immigrants influence the development of the United States, especially in the areas of civil and political rights. What we have learned so far from the European is that when you are in a disadvantaged position, you must organize for your rights. We will see that this is also true for all immigrants, especially involuntary immigrants, the black beans. So, let's talk about white versus black labor forces in the British colonies in the area that became known as the American South. Now, there is a problem with regards to the South in general and the Chesapeake in particular that historians have difficulty confronting. Why did the transformation from a free labor system to a slave labor system occur? And that seems to be the question. Now, most colonial historians argue that it was essentially economics. Slaves were less expensive than indentured servants and more profitable. They were better agriculturalists than those coming from England, and they could withstand semi-tropical weather and the accompanying diseases while working in excruciating conditions. So let's look at how slaves were valued as labor forces for the production of goods and services in the southern United States.
Slavery first appeared on American plantations very early in colonial times. Jamestown, Virginia, America's first English colonial settlement, was founded in 1607. Just 12 years later, the first Africans were sold here to work on tobacco plantations. As the smoking habit spread, tobacco became the most valuable export of the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. As that happened, the number of tobacco plantations increased and more slaves were imported, so that by 1750, about 200,000 black slaves were living in the English colonies of America. In the colonies of South Carolina and Georgia, most slaves were forced to work in huge flooded fields like this one, where rice was raised, or on plantations where indigo plants were cultivated, from which a valuable blue dye was made. In colonial times, the lands along the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas to Florida, were ruled by Spain or France. In this area, the majority of slaves worked on large sugarcane plantations, similar to those in the West Indies. Cotton, the plant most people associate with slavery, did not become an important crop until well after American independence.
Okay, so again, the first question was, why did the transformation from a free labor system to a slave labor system occur? And most importantly, with regards to the slave labor system, why did it become racially defined? So historians debate and consider whether racial prejudice preceded the introduction of slaves or whether it developed after bondage. Many writing generalized textbooks for U.S. history classes essentially take the position that race itself was largely coincidental, that economics was more important. After all, by the time that the British entered the slave trade, the Spanish, Dutch, and the Portuguese were already involved. So the easy answer becomes that racism developed afterwards. Moreover, the argument continues that blacks were preferred because as runaways, they were more easily definable. Slavery was not introduced at the beginning of colonization or the creation of colonies. There were black and white servants, but colonizers, historians argue, had no idea of slavery. It was after 1650 that the emphasis on color evolved, so a distinction was needed between servitude and slavery so as to encourage settlement. Whereas whites voluntarily came, blacks were forced to come. To add to this debate, racism was imposed from above late in the 17th century as a response to a white indentured rebellion in 1670 that became known as Bacon's Rebellion. Now, racism did not bring about slavery, but rather the master class was worried about the white masses uprising. Slaves conveniently replaced the threat of white masses rebelling. So that's the explanation that historians provide. That's the explanation that is a debate in the early colonial history. But there is an alternative explanation. When we take a look at European culture, and European culture itself, the existence of prejudice is already in the culture. Europe in general and the British in specific had a background of racism prior to colonial expansion. So in essence, really the answer is that both factors, economics and racism, were operating.